Thank you. Thank you all for inviting me. This is wonderful. It gave my husband and I a chance to come down and visit your beautiful country down here. And we really like Durango. It's a nice town. Fred and I are both Denver natives, so we don't get over to this part of Colorado very often. I am Diann Kissell. I'm a Denver native. I was born into a very large Catholic Latino family. My father was from Puerto Rico, and I'm the fifth of 10 children. And we grew up in kind of a, by anybody's observation, my father would have been the quintessential father. He was a man that worked hard every day. He came home, didn't stop in the bars or do any of that kind of stuff, made our toys, played games with us, did all of those kind of things. And was a churchgoer that went to church twice every Sunday, once to sing in the choir and once to usher. And we were raised in the church and Catholic school and all of that kind of stuff. And my father was a very good family man, but he was a very flawed man. And he was a pedophile. And I was his victim of choice. I have 7 brothers and 2 sisters, but my sister, he tried with her one time, and she was old enough, and she jumped off the bed and said she was going to tell Mom, and I was 5 years old when it started with me. And a little more impressionable, loved my daddy, and so when I was 5, I told my mom one night, I said, "Why does Daddy take me out of the bed and sit me on his lap?" And well, what I said was, "Why does Daddy take me out of the bed, sit me on his lap, and try and stick something in my butt?" That's what I remember saying. And so it stopped for a little while, and when I was 6, it started again. And resumed thereafter, and my father said, excuse me, I think I'm going to have a little bit of problem just because of the smoke down here. My dad said, "All daddies do this, but let's just keep this between us, but it's okay." And I remember just feeling I didn't like what he was doing, and it didn't feel right. But I was also a good Catholic girl who went to a Catholic school, and one of the main tenets was honor your father and your mother, right? And so I believed my dad when he said, "All daddies do this." And of course, initially it started with fondling and all of that. My dad was very good at making opportunities to be alone with me. We had an attic in our house, and he was always finding ways to get me up to the attic by myself and things like that. And also, he used to collect papers to recycle. That was another way to subsidize the family income a little bit, and so he'd always take me along with him. So there was way too much time that I was spending with my dad. And even if we brought the little brothers and sisters along, they were in the back seat, and he kept me in the front seat with him, so there was lots of opportunity. I never liked it. And so, like most victims, you get another persona. And so I had my other Diana, which we'll call her, and she was the one that when my dad would say, "Diana, come down here," I would switch out of my Diana, the sister, the good girl mode, and change into my dad's plaything. And I would, as he was doing his things to me, my mind would be elsewhere, and then we'd get done, and when I'd head back downstairs or upstairs, depending on which house we lived in, I would change back to my normal self. And this went on for a long time, and as the years went by, it progressed more and more. I can't tell you how tickled he was when I started going through puberty and all of those things. So I'm going to say also, if any of you get triggered by this, please take advantage of the therapists here, because my story is triggering. If you have any kind of background at all, you're gonna feel what I say. Anyway, when I was 11 years old, I did start my period, and my father also started intercourse. And I can remember thinking that I was pregnant, and so I told a friend at school, who told a nun, who told the priest, and the priest called my parents in to talk to them. And I was mortified. And what happened with that is that my father disappeared for 2 months. And that was the most horrible thing. Plus, it was the first time I took the weight of my family on me. I knew it was my fault that he disappeared. He left my mother with 9 children and no visible means of support. And our name was splashed in the newspapers in Denver. And I was full of shame because I knew it was my fault. My father always told me, don't talk. Don't talk to anybody, and I broke that rule. And so my father came back after 2 months, and my mother promised me that he would leave me alone now. And I believed her. And he did for about a month. But you have to understand with my dad, if he wasn't allowed to do that, then he was a very cruel man. And so he was as quick with the belt as anybody. And for the smallest transgressions, the belt would be off and I'd be getting it. And not just me, because his frustration and his anger would impact the whole family. And so that was another thing that I carried was the weight of knowing that I could keep the rest of my family safe if I allowed him to do what he wanted to do with me. And so we have all these little things working around in your head, the whole time. And if I didn't allow him, then I wasn't allowed to see friends. I wasn't allowed to talk on the phone. I wasn't allowed to do anything. And like I said, he'd watch me dry dishes, and if there was the littlest hint of water on there, he'd say, you did it wrong, and come here, and I'd get it with the belt. So I learned real young, because that started real young, I learned real young that if I was to have any kind of life at all, I needed to let my dad do what he wanted to do. And then if I allowed that, then I could actually have some semblance of a life. I could have friends, and I could do all of that kind of stuff. Well, after my dad came back, it lasted a month, and then he started with everyday intercourse after that month. And he would make lots of opportunities to be alone with me, and he would have the family go to church and have me stay home with the littlest babies, and of course rape me while they were playing in another room or something like that. So I actually hated Sundays because I always knew what it was going to be. Anyway, that lasted until I was 13. And then after a particularly heinous night with my dad, I just said, I'm done. I just can't do this anymore. This is horrible. And so I ran away. And I remember jumping off the roof of our house, and I sprained my ankle, and I remember hobbling down the street, and I went to my mother's cousin, was the mother superior at an orphanage, and I went there. And she didn't really know what to do with me, so she called an aunt, and they came and picked me up. And my aunt asked why I was running away, and I actually told her. Because after my dad left for those 2 months, I never said anything to anybody. And I told her, and so they called my parents in, and again I was mortified, because I knew I was going to be in trouble, because by that time my father had been telling me, if you talk, I'll kill you. And, as quick as he was with the belt, I was pretty clear that he could do that. And so anyway, my aunt and uncle confronted my parents, and I was in the other room, and I could hear all the talk and the anger, and I was scared to death to go home. But we left, and of course silence in the car, and I was just scared. I don't think my dad looked at me that whole week. He was so angry with me. And then he left me alone. That was Sunday night, and he left me alone Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and on Friday night, he came into my bedroom. My sister and I always shared a bed, and this time he came up and started fooling with me, and my sister woke up, and she said, what are you doing? And he said, well, I'm tucking Diann in, and she said, no, you're not, and I'm telling Mom. Well, my sister had never woken up before. And what I learned is my mother told my sister that week, keep an eye on Diann, keep an eye on Dad. And so for the first time, she was kind of given permission, What I know for sure is probably my whole family knew something was happening, But it was like kind of the elephant in the room. Nobody ever really said anything because we were all kind of afraid of Dad and all of that. So all of it was kept in secret. But as soon as my sister had the opportunity, she was aware, right? Well, anyway, he left. And about 3 o'clock that morning, I woke up and there was policemen standing at the foot of our bed. And I woke up my sister and we said, "What are you doing here?" He says, "Well, your dad's hurt your mom." And so we got up and we woke up the other brothers and we went looking for we had a little brother that slept in a bed and there was a little alcove in our bedroom and he was missing. And then we were missing another little brother, and so the policeman came back upstairs and we said, "Well, where are they?" And he said, "Well, your dad hurt them too." We said, "Well, what do you mean by hurt them?" And he said, "Well, they're all dead." My father had figured out that it would bring less shame to the family to kill the whole family and himself than to be found out as a pedophile. Well, he did. He killed my mother. He killed the two youngest, and then he went to the next one, and his name was Alan, and he was the favorite of the family. He was mentally disabled, and he was just a little boy that was nothing but love, you know. And while he was killing him, Alan woke up and said, "Daddy, Daddy, don't," and that kind of took him out of his trance. He tried to kill himself, couldn't go through with it, so he called his brothers and sisters in New York and called the police on himself, and that's how he got turned in. For me, I had my first breakdown that night, and I watched him being taken away in handcuffs, and I knew I had killed my mother. It was my fault. Had I not talked, she would still be alive. Not only that, but she killed my precious babies, because in a big family like that, my sister and I was the fifth. My sister was older than me. We were the only two girls. And the boys always did outside jobs, and my sister and I did all the inside domestic jobs. And she had the two older of the four babies, and I had the two younger of the four babies. We took care of them in the morning, we got them dressed, we got them ready before we went to school, came home at lunch and fed them, and got them to bed at night. They were like ours, and so he killed my babies. And I was just devastated. And like I said, I had my first breakdown then. My father pled guilty so that I wouldn't have to testify against him. That's something I will always be grateful for. That was a very scary time. And my father was sentenced to execution the same week that President Kennedy was assassinated. I can guarantee you that was not a happy week in my life. And at that time, I also said I cried so much in those 6 months from the time my mother died till Kennedy was, till my father was sentenced to death. And I said, "I'm done crying. I'm just done crying. I'm not going to cry anymore." And so I effectively turned off my tears at the age of 13. And I was pretty good at it. Well, what happened to me, as soon as my mother was laid to rest, my second personality, my father's plaything, came out. And we're going to call her Sandra because that's the name I always gave out to strangers. And I literally, the day after my mother was put to rest, stood on a street corner and let men pick me up. And there were always plenty of men out there trolling. It's amazing how many are out there, just waiting for somebody who's vulnerable. And I'd get in their car and they'd take me to some alley or some park or something, have their way with me, take me back to the corner. And that's how I was. Because my father taught me at a very young age that my body's worth nothing. You're worth nothing. I had no self-esteem, no love of self at all. I was nobody. And so that's how I lived my life. The interesting thing is nobody knew this about me because it was all in secret. Nobody knew that I was doing these things. I would come home and then just be sister and helpmate, and the seven of us, we were very lucky. My aunt and uncle took in the seven of us left. And we lived with them, and you know, they knew I went to the library most days and stuff, because that was always my place of solace. Even when I was really young, I would go to the library every day, because that was a place my dad couldn't get me, number one. And I could lose myself in books. And so me saying I was going to go to the library was no problem. And so, you know, for me to leave and go to the library and just stand on the corner of the library and get picked up was no big deal. But again, nobody knew this about me except me. But as the year went on, that particular year, my aunt knew that I was troubled. I was more troubled. I used to sneak out at night and do those things. And, you know, losing your mother at 13 is bad enough, but just being a teenager is bad, right? I mean, we go through things, so you topple on all this other stuff on top of it. It was a bad time. And so they did do something that was really wonderful all of the time. I just hated my aunt. And she took me and she put me in a place called the Good Shepherd Home, and it was a home run by nuns. And it wasn't a detention, it was a home for troubled girls. And again, I was so angry with my aunt because she took me away from my friends and my family and all of that. But it was a very safe place for me to be. And while I was there, I met other girls like me who had been raped by fathers or uncles or brothers. And I wasn't alone, because before that, you know, my dad always said all daddies do this, but I would try talking to people and say, you know, did your dad ever do something kind of weird that you don't like? You know, like to your body? No, you know. So I knew that it wasn't all daddies that did this. But all of a sudden I met some girls that had understood me. And so that was a really good thing. What I need to say also is my father was in jail, and something that I think of now, and I just think it's so absurd that we did this, but my brothers and sisters and I went every Sunday to visit him. And even when he was down in Canyon City, we went every Sunday to visit him. And so my father died with the love of his children intact, which I think is remarkable. He was in Canyon City for 4 years, and in 1966, the capital punishment was reinstated in Colorado. And so my father asked for no stay of execution, and so he was executed in 1967. And it was play-by-play on the radio, because nothing like that had happened for years and years and years and years in Colorado. So we listened to our father die on the radio. Whenever anything with my dad would crop up, so would Sandra. And so when I was in the Good Shepherd Home, of course, I was protected, and I was good, and all of that. But the other thing you have to know is that my family's name was splashed in the newspaper almost daily for years and years and years and years and years. And so whenever it was a big thing, Sandra would show up, because Sandra was linked to my dad. So if my dad was around, so was Sandra. And so after I got out of the Good Shepherd Home, I was put into a foster home, which I asked to go into because at the time I was still angry with my aunt. And I'll backtrack a second. When I was 15, I got out of the Good Shepherd Home. My sister was getting married, and I was her maid of honor, and I got out, and I was going to stay out. And the best man raped me as we were going to go decorate her car and all that. We were all drinking, and I was 15. They're giving me bourbon, and I was a stupid 15-year-old, and I was drinking it. But anyway, I got raped that night, and I didn't think it was raped. I said I allowed him to do it because, you know, I had allowed my dad to do all this to me, right? So, but it was rape, and it was very traumatizing, so I asked to go back into the Good Shepherd Home, and I stayed there for another year before I went into foster care. And so now there's another guilt thing because I ruined my sister's wedding. You know, I didn't have to do that. It was my fault. And so life went on, and my father was executed, and again Sandra came out with a with a vengeance, you know. And again, nobody knew, just me. And I was real lucky. Like I said, I lived in a foster home, and when he was executed, I had just was at the end of the year of my 11th grade, and the teachers and stuff, I was a student assist, so I worked in the office in between classes and stuff, and so they all really loved me. So they got me a scholarship to CSU, and that was a real good thing. And at the summer before I went to college, I met a guy in the Air Force, and he was stationed down at Lowry, and I proceeded to get pregnant. And went off to college not telling anybody I was pregnant. I knew I was pregnant, I didn't tell anybody. And went off to college also saying, you know, that's it, I'm done with guys. Done with guys. And the very first day of college, as I'm doing registration, there's a guy standing across the room from me, and our eyes locked, you know. And the next thing I know, I went out with him that night. And the next night we went out, and he wanted to have sex, and I knew that this was a guy I was interested in. So that's a real interesting thing, because I never had sex with boyfriends, except for the one guy that I got pregnant with. My other boyfriends I didn't, but I'd go with some stranger, you know. And so I knew I was interested in this guy, so I said, well, we can have sex, that's fine, but then I won't ever see you again. So if you want to see me again, the answer is no. And don't you know, he said he wanted to see me, and wow, that was like an amazing thing. Mm-hmm. So we went out like 5 times, and then we spent one night on the phone for about 5 hours. We were both up at CSU, and I told him about me. And I also told him I was pregnant. And he said that didn't matter to him and all of that kind of stuff. So I thought I found my Prince Charming. And so we dated, and he was with me all the time that I was pregnant and everything. And he was with me after I gave my baby up for adoption, because back in 1969, you didn't keep your babies. You gave them up for adoption, and I did. Plus, I could have kept her. But I knew how I wanted to be as a mother. I knew I wanted to be able to raise my child. I didn't want somebody else to raise them. And I knew I was just a poor little church mouse, and I could not afford to raise that child right. So I gave her up for adoption. Still the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. And he and I ended up getting married. And we had 4 children in very quick succession. And I needed to have those babies for a couple of reasons. I needed to replace the one I had given away. And I needed to be like my mom, you know. My mother had 14 pregnancies in 18 years. And so that was the way you did it, right? And so, and the other thing is I've been taking care of babies since I was a baby myself. Started changing diapers when I was 5 years old. Always helped out with the little kids. So that was the one area of my life I knew I was good. I was a good mommy, right? And so I loved my babies. But my husband, and he was like this before we ever got married. When I met him, he had just come back from Vietnam doing the most dangerous job in Vietnam, and it was as a door gunner. And most of you are way too young to remember the Tet Offensive and things like that, which was horrible. They were supposed to have a ceasefire, and the Vietnamese came in and just slaughtered the soldiers. And he had a lot of problems. We call it PTSD now. Back then they didn't have any names for it, but I knew he had problems. But I had so many problems that he could just blame everything on me, and I'd just take it. Well, my husband was an alcoholic. And he really had been since before we got married, but like most young people, you know, my love is just going to change. You know, all this is going to get better. You know, and the reality is, we all know, is we don't change other people, right? We can change ourselves, but we don't change other people. And so my marriage from the very beginning was a difficult marriage. we had a lust. We had an incredible lust, but we didn't have a lot of else. He was one to close the bars most every night and that kind of thing. He had his own business, and for most of a good part of our marriage life, we didn't have much money. You know, we were always scrimping and stuff because he had his own business and it hadn't taken off yet, and I was a stay-at-home mom and all of that, and I'd earn money doing, you know, odd jobs, this and that, but basically we were always scrambling for money, and yet there was always money to go out drinking and doing that kind of thing. So we had a real volatile marriage, and I thought many times that I needed to leave him, but I had, again, no self-esteem, no self-confidence. I couldn't do it, and he told me, you can't make it without me. And I believed him because who am I? I'm nobody. I didn't have any belief in myself. And so we went on, but we've been married 6 years, and at that time I thought about leaving him, and he threatened to take my kids away from me. Well, I just couldn't possibly do that, so I stayed with them. But then something happened after that was for the first time in 10 years, someone was going to get executed in the United States. And because of that, you could not turn on the TV, you could not open a newspaper, I could not listen to the radio without hearing my family name on there and stories about my dad. First time I saw my dad's grave in Canyon City was on TV. I mean, the newspapers are relentless with getting stuff out, right? They don't care who they hurt getting the news out. And so it was a hard time, so again, what happened? Sandra showed up. And she did, and so I had a couple of affairs. And didn't feel good, but that's she kind of took over my life again. And the other thing that happened is I couldn't sleep, because if I closed my eyes, I had nightmares. And not just nightmares, I started remembering everything. I always knew my skeleton story. I could tell you, this happened to me, blah, 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 but all the fill-in stuff was coming out. And I really couldn't close my eyes without having nightmares, and I was waking up screaming every night, and I couldn't take a nap. I'd wake up, screaming from that. It was a really tough time. And I told my husband, I need therapy. And he said, oh no. He said, you're not going to go, air our dirty laundry in front of everybody. I said, that has nothing to do with your laundry. It has to do with me. You know what my life has been. I need help. And he said, oh, no. And so a couple days later, he came home, and I was sitting at the table, and I said, we need to talk. I said, to me, there's two choices here. You can let me go get therapy, and we can stay married. Or you can say no, and we'll get a divorce, and then I'll get therapy. But either way, I need help. And so he finally acquiesced, and I started getting help. And the first time I went to the therapist, I went through Jefferson County Mental Health, because again, we didn't have a lot of money. And her name was Janet Kaufman, or Janice Kaufman. And I sat down, and she said, well, Diann, what brings you here today? And I said, from the time I was 5 until I was 13, my father incested me. And then he killed my family. Killed my mother, 2 brothers and sister, and he was executed. And she's like, oh, Diann, who do we have here? I can still remember her face. I mean, she was just like, oh. And then she says, okay. Why'd you come today? And so then I was able to just start talking. And she helped me. She helped me a lot. And I went to her for 6 months, and thought I was cured, 6 months, I'm all there. Oh, life is, roses. Everything is wonderful. But the thing she told me at the end was your homework is to talk to all those people that were in your life back then and tell them about you. Because the way I saw it is everybody thought I was bad, that I wasn't any good. I killed my mother. You know, my father ran away because of me. You know, I had a baby out of wedlock. I was it was terrible in my family. And so she said, talk to everybody that was in your life. Because as far as my family knew, I had been molested one night. The night my mother was murdered. And so I did, and I started with my oldest brother. And I invited him over for lunch, and he says, oh, okay, Diann, what do you want to talk about? And so I told him my story. And an amazing thing happened. First of all, he stood up. I can never get through this part without crying. He stood up and put his arms around me and told me how much he loved me. And prior to that, I never thought I was lovable. And then the other thing he said was, had I known any of this, we would have never gone to see Dad. And the other thing he said is, I should have known and I should have helped you. And of course, those were just incredible things to say to me. And so as I went down each of my family member, the reaction was the same with all of them. And I was no longer unlovable in my family. I had people who loved me. And they always had, I just didn't know it, because I didn't love myself at all. I also was able to talk to the priest. What I didn't say was, my very first confession when I was 7 years old, I confessed adultery. And this priest, because I went to Catholic school, we went to confession every Friday. Never said anything, and I always said the same things. And it wasn't a fluke. He didn't hear wrong. Plus, he knew my father, and he'd already confronted them about this, and nobody ever stepped in. So I was able to, the universe opened some doors. I called our old church, at the old rectory, and our priest had moved away many years ago, but they said, he happens to be visiting right now. And so I was able to confront him. And of course he hid behind the seal of confession, and I understand that. But I've talked with many priests since then, and I understand the seal of confession, but I also understand that even without that, you didn't have to tell anybody, but you could have talked to that child and guided them to talk to somebody, or guided them in the right direction. And so I still blame him for not helping me. But anyway, I was able to confront him, and that helped a lot. And I was able to tell my aunts and everybody and explain to them why I was sexually promiscuous, had been sexually promiscuous, how it was that I got pregnant, all of these things, and then they were able to understand. And that was a very freeing thing. Like I said, I thought I was all well. 6 months of therapy, man. All these problems are all gone. And they were pretty much. I was able to resume taking care of my children well, and because there for a while it was kind of iffy. And during that time of when this other man was going to get executed, it had gotten to me bad enough that my 5-year-old son one day took his little siblings, there were 3 other little siblings by then, downstairs, and just kept them down there all day and said, Mommy needs to be alone. That's pretty bad when your little 5-year-old's got to take over for you. But I was back to myself, and I was at that time then teaching, taking dance classes and teaching fitness, and just starting to feel good about myself. I changing some things about myself, changed my hairdo, just was starting to have a little bit of self-esteem. And then, this is going to sound silly, but my husband decided to grow a mustache. Now that's no big deal. Growing a mustache, a lot of men look really good in mustaches. My husband looked just like my dad in a mustache. And I always knew he kind of looked like my dad, but when he wore a mustache, he really looked like my dad. And I asked him to shave, and he says, oh no. He says, I kind of like this. I said, do you understand what's happening here? Because even when we try being intimate, I'd have to stop it. I'd say, my dad's in the room. You have to leave me alone. My dad's here. It's not you. And so he knew these things were going on, but he didn't want to do anything about it. Well, one night we were out and we stopped at a 7-Eleven to get change for the babysitter. And I left the car and started wandering. I don't know any of this stuff. I was just told about it. And ended up, somebody found me and took me home. And I guess when my husband opened the door, I started beating on him and screaming at him and that I hate you and all of these things. And I was talking to my dad. What I did was I reverted to my 13-year-old self. And I ended up being taken away in a straitjacket to St. Anthony's Hospital, psych ward. And again, this is all told to me by other people that were there. Unfortunately, all my children were there, and some of them had friends spending the night, and all of this. So, it was pretty traumatic. When I woke up in the hospital, though, the doctor was sitting in front of me, and he said, well, hi. And I said, hi. He says, do you know where you are? And I said, no, not really. And he said, well, do you remember anything about last night? And I said, mm. He said, well, you're here at St. Anthony's. And he told me about what happened. And I told him, I don't remember any of that, but what I do know is that it feels like a big weight has been lifted off of me. And so we talked for quite a while, and again, I look for universal signs. I'm very much a God believer, but I look at it broader than a lot of people. I look at it as the universe. And I just felt this weight lifted off of me, and when my husband took me home that day, I'd had this impatient plant that had had buds on it for months. Wouldn't open, and I went home and they were all open. And the other thing is, all of my tulips were in bloom. And they hadn't been, and I just felt like God was saying, the worst is over. And you'll never go that dark again. And so I went back into therapy. Clearly, I needed it. And I started working on other things. And the other thing I did was I started reading every self-help book there was out there. And I read them all. And I also was reading spirituality books because I needed to find a way to relate to God that wasn't fire and brimstone. Because I needed a God in my life. But I didn't want that one that was up there judging. The one that, we heard about in school and all of that kind of stuff. I needed a God that came from love. And so I started reading about spirituality and about reincarnation, and I don't ask anybody to believe what I did, but for me, that was real empowering, because if I believed in reincarnation, then that meant I chose this family for a reason, and that I set this stuff in motion so that I could grow spiritually in this life. And so that gave me a little bit of control in my life. And so again, I didn't preach it to anybody else, but it gave me a little bit of control for my own life. And so I was starting to get better and stronger, and along with reading of your self-help book and everything, I stumbled into this most incredible place called the Women's School Network. Any of you go to any of the COVA meetings? Okay, then you know Nancy Lewis. She was the director of that's how I met Nancy Lewis to begin with. She was the director of the Women's School Network, and what an incredible place it was. It was a place that classes for women, just for women. It was all about self-esteem and self-worth and loving yourself and all of these things. But they also had a couple of extra classes that were just so empowering, and one of them was anger. Because although each of my family members got mad at Dad, I was never able to quite, except for that night I had a breakdown. I was never able to really just be angry. And so I was able to. I took this class, and we was at a hotel, and they had, 50 pillows and things like that. There was only 5 other women, and there was 2 facilitators, and we were able to scream and throw and do all of that thing. And after that, I felt so free, because I'd had this knot of anger in here that I'd never been able to voice. And I was still blaming myself for a lot of this stuff, even with therapy. A lot of that stuff was still there. And then they had this incredible class, the most incredible class. It was a class on forgiveness. And that one was done through journaling. And it took me 9 months of journaling to do it. And I started with my mother. And I just started journaling. And as a woman, I was able to relate to my mother as a woman. Not just as my mother, but try and put myself in her place with 9 children. This was the early 1960s. There weren't all these wonderful therapists and all these organizations to go to for help. You know, I don't know that she knew that she had any resources anywhere to help me. And how do you help one child and forget the other 9? And so I was able to, through that process, forgive my mother. And then I started on my dad, and I was able to work through, and he had been orphaned when he was 8 years old, and he had been brought to New York by his older brother, and he lived in foster home. And I found out many years later that he had been molested by a neighbor. And this was, I didn't know this when I was doing my forgiveness, but I always knew that something had happened to my dad to make him who he was. Because I don't believe we're born pedophiles. I don't believe that's who you are when you're born, but something happens to you to change, skew something in that brain that you think that that's okay. But anyway, I was able to forgive my father, but the most incredible thing happened when I forgave my father, is I forgave myself. No longer did I believe I was responsible for everything. I was able to start actually loving myself. And in the process of loving myself, I knew I needed to get out of a very toxic marriage. Our marriage didn't ever get any better. He's quite frankly, he's still an alcoholic, and that's who he is. And that's how we will probably always be. I don't see that ever changing for him. But I didn't need to live with it anymore. But what happened for me to finally make the final move is I was in lots of, I was taking, I was seeing therapists at the time, and I was really working everything through the Women's School Network and all of that. And one night, my husband was real drunk, and he raped me. And people said, well, you know, you can't get raped when you're married, and that's a bunch of bullshit, excuse me. You can. And I was very open sexually because I'd been bred into sex. But there was one thing I wouldn't allow, and that's what he did to me. So in the morning when he got up, I was waiting at the base of the stairs, and I told him, you need to leave. And he said, what? I said, you raped me last night, and I will never be a victim again. I was 38 years old. Finally found my voice. Never be a victim again. And he did leave. Started back into therapy again with some other people. And started trying to get my life back together. And it was hard. When my husband left, he says, you know, I supported this family for 15 years. It's your turn. Never gave me a dime. Had 4 teenagers. And a supporting income, certainly not a providing income. But somehow we made it, and I just took on every odd job I could find. I always say I was a jack of all trades, master of none, but I can do a lot of things, let me tell you. Anything that somebody said, you can make some money, I said, okay, I'm here. And I did it, and me and the kids, including making burritos most nights, and my kids could eat burritos, breakfast, lunch, dinner. So they'd start a pot of beans, and I'd make tortillas, and we'd have them for dinner, and then we'd roll up all the rest, and I'd take them into work and sell them, and that would be gas money. And I did data entry, and I did massage, and I did hair cutting and giving perms, and I did whatever. I cleaned somebody's house. It didn't matter because I needed to support my kids. And so we struggled along, but having 4 teenagers, when I had 4 kids in 5 years, I neglected to remember that they'd all be teenagers. That's a pretty big thing to forget. And I had one daughter that was actually acting a lot like me as a teenager. And I always felt like there was something that had caused that, but she wouldn't tell me what it was. But I got her into therapy. And, that was actually before my husband left. I got her into therapy, and then the therapist said, what we really think you need is family therapy. Not therapy. So we all went, family therapy, and we did that for a couple weeks, and then they said, what you really need is marriage counseling. And so we started going to that, and then that was during the time that my husband raped me, and we went in to see them, and I told them, I said, we're getting a divorce, and I want you to know it was a husband-wife team. They clapped. They clapped when I said we were getting a divorce. And after he left, they said, we've never seen anybody less emotional. And my husband had told me many years before that from the time he was a real young boy, he learned to have a poker face, so nobody would ever know what he was feeling. And then he's got this crazy wife who feels everything, and so it was a pretty funky match. And anyway, with my husband gone, even though I had the 4 teenagers, somehow we were making it. We were doing it. And I stayed in therapy, and then I started getting the best therapy I ever had. And it was inner child work. And I'm sure a lot of you are therapists and you know what that is. And for the first time, somebody said that I could go in and heal that little girl and take her out of the situations that she was in because nobody else did. And that really worked for me. And from then I just started growing and growing, and one of my brothers during that time committed suicide because he had never been able to get over what happened to us, for what my dad did, and plus he was bipolar, but anyway, on the way home from his funeral in West Virginia, I was on the plane, and I just said very consciously, you're not going to win with me. You took my brother, and I'm talking to my dad, you're not going to win with me. I'm going to beat you. And so the same week I turned 40, I went back to school and got an associate's degree and was going to school with my kids, and thank God they're very smart kids because they helped me through my algebra and stuff, because that is not my forte. Only pass those classes because my kids. But along with that, when I got my associate's degree, I also got a $7,000 a year raise. And so all of a sudden, providing for them was just a little bit easier. And meanwhile, my husband and I hadn't gotten divorced because I couldn't afford a divorce. And then he did something really bad. My brother said, get a divorce, I'll pay for it. So we were at divorce court. And he comes over to me and he says, well, we can't get divorced till all these bills are paid. And I said, well, can I look at that list? And he hands it to me, and I cross all of them off but one. And he says, what are you doing? I said, well, all these are paid. He said, I'm not going to pay for that one because you incurred it after you left, and it's for a bar, and I'm not doing that. And then he said, well, and I said, and I'm in school, and I'm doing this, and I'm doing that. And he looked at me. We'd been married together. We'd been married 20 years, and he looked at me, and he said, you are smart, aren't you? Mm-hmm. Because his favorite word for me was stupid. And that was just Anyway, the kids and I started doing pretty good. And I met a man, and he was a real nice man. His name was Stan. And he really helped me. He helped me financially. He just, wanted to protect me. And it was all of this, and that was a real nice help. It wasn't such a burden in my life. But the only trouble is that we were... it was total swing of the pendulum. Total swing of the pendulum. There was no stopping in the middle at all. And, he was a really good guy, but unfortunately he had no communication skills. You couldn't sit and talk with him. If you talk about anything besides sports or dogs or his lawn or his cars, and his eyes would glaze over. Get those little things like in the cartoons, And, we didn't have a lot in common, but he was real safe. And then a silly little thing happened that was when the movie Beauty and the Beast came out. And we rented it one night, and we were watching it. And I can't even tell you what it did to my heart. What it spoke to me and said is, that's what I deserve. I deserve a Prince Charming. I've done all this work to get healthy. I've worked really, really hard to change my life, take control back of my life. I deserve someone in my life that's going to complement that and be my partner through life. And poor Stan, as I told him I needed to break up with him. Well, this is a man who never once hurt me, never once said an unkind word to me, was always good to me, was good to my kids. But I knew that I deserved the best. And so we did break up, and as again, the universe steps in real interestingly. He went, it took me 3 months to move out, but I did move out, and right after I moved out, he went to Maine to see his dad, who was pretty ill, and while he was there, he got sideswiped by a semi, and his brainstem was crushed. So I went out to Maine, and I spent 8 days watching him die. But I was able in those 8 days to talk to him and pour everything out that was in my heart. And so when he passed, I knew that it was okay. And I truly believe he did that so that I could find my Prince Charming. Because while he was there, his mother took all of her grief out on me and had the locks on his house changed. Well, and they took my dog, and his house was still furnished with all my furniture. So I had to get an attorney to get it and all of that. And I was frantic, and like I always called my oldest brother and said, I have to be out of there on Sunday between noon and 3, and it was a whole house full of furniture. And he said, well, he said, remember my friend Fred Kissell? And I said, yeah. He said, well, see, he's got a truck. And I said, okay. Well, I got over there, and actually one of my daughters, her boyfriend, got a truck, and they had it mostly half full and everything, and Fred was there waiting for me, and we helped with the rest, and we got it over to my other apartment, and Fred and I stood outside talking for like 3 hours. This is unheard of. Whoever just talked with a man for 3 hours. And he heard me. He heard me and talked back and shared. This was kind of an amazing thing in my life. And so we talked, and well, Stan had just passed, and Fred had just gone through something. Neither of us were ready for a relationship, but I knew that this was somebody I'd like to talk to again. And so about 3 months later, he called me on a Monday and asked me out for that night. I need to back up. He worked for the newspaper, so his hours were nuts. And so he couldn't schedule things in advance a whole lot, but I didn't know that. But he called me on Monday, wanted to go out Monday night. And what happened with me is after Stan died, how I dealt with it was by staying so busy that I didn't have time to sit and wallow and cry. And like I said, I had turned off my tears many years ago, so I couldn't just sit and do that. So I was just busy. So he called me on Monday, and I said, I'm so sorry, I'm busy tonight, but be persistent. He called me on Wednesday, asked me out for Wednesday night, and I said, I'm so sorry. I have plans already. Be persistent. Called me on Friday, invited me to the inauguration game of the Colorado Rockies. And I would have loved to have gone, but I was working at the Teller House Casino at the time, and I was the next in seniority, and everybody above me had left to go to the game. And I needed to stay there, so I couldn't go. So on Sunday, I went to my brother's. It was Easter, and he said, well, has Fred called you? And I said, well, yeah, he's called me 3 times, and it just hasn't worked out, but I'm a little worried because he's quite a bit older than me. And he said, well, if it helps, he says, he's my oldest friend, but he's my youngest friend. And I said, well, okay. So he showed up at my place of work on Monday. And the best I can say on that is the rest is history. I had 3 things I was supposed to do that night. And I had him take me up to I was waiting to get shuttled to my car. And I said, well, why don't you take me up to my car? And then during that time I said, well, if you want to buy me a drink in Golden at Senior Frogs. And so we went down there, and 5 hours later we were still sitting there talking. And we went out again on Wednesday to a Rockies game. So I at least got to go the inaugural week. And then we went again on Friday. On Saturdays I took my girls to dinner and I said, I think I met the man I'm going to marry. And God blessed me so much. Again, I really believe that Stan died so that I could have a very uncomplicated, wonderful relationship that had no baggage, no strings, no anything. Fred and I have been together since then. He always said he gave me a key so I could come in and out sometimes, and I quite frankly never left. And he kind of had to take me. And but I say all this because I told you the first 40 years of my life, which were not good. But I have such a blessed life now. I have such a blessed life. Between us, we have 8 children. We have 20 grandchildren and 8 great-grandchildren and a new one on the way. And our life is so full. We give back. We do mission trips to Mexico. We're able to do all of these things I always wished I could do that I could never do. My life is just full of abundance and blessings and love. From a little girl who never thought she was lovable, I have more love in my life than anybody I know. I could not ask for more. And what I want to say is there's a couple of big lessons that I've learned in this process. And one is the choices you make. Choice 1 is I asked for help. Choice 1 is I asked for help. I knew I needed help and I got it. And I kept asking for help until I was well. I kept pushing, and it wasn't easy. For those of you who are therapists, who work with clients who have gone through this, you know this process is hard. For me, it was many, many layers. I had to peel the onion. I had to do each layer and then take time off to regroup, get enough energy to go to the next level. And I just kept doing it. So it's choices. We make choices every day. And we make choices in simple things every day. So I say that you start each day with a grateful heart. Start each day with blessings. Look at your blessings. Don't look at what is bad. And if you can start your day with blessings, your whole day is going to be better. And I always use the thing about, especially in Denver traffic, you know, you get cut off and you want to flip the bird, you want to cuss them out and do all that kind of stuff. And if you do that, then you get into work and you're already pissed. And somebody says something to you, so you're pissed at your coworker now, and you're mad at your boss, and you're this, and you go home, and then you're mad at your family. Or the other side of that, if you look at the blessing of it, oh, thank you, God, for him not hitting me. You know, I don't have to pay for insurance, and you go on with your day because you changed your message. And we have that power to change our messages, to change what's happening to us. Just because it was given to us does not mean, but it has to define who we are the rest of our life. It can, because that's a choice too. We can choose to stay victims. We can always choose to stay victims, and that's an easy way to do it. Miserable way, because then you don't have that happiness and all that blessings and all the wonderful things. But we have that choice to change that. So I encourage anybody to get out of the victim role and start moving forward. And the other thing is the forgiveness piece, and I think this is the most powerful of all. Because when you're angry with somebody, and we all know this, it sits like a hot coal in your belly. And every time you see that person, it just jabs you a little bit more. And you just pile on that stuff, right? And so that just hurts. It physically hurts you. It never hurts that other person. It hurts you. So if you can forgive them, and you don't have to confront a person to forgive them. My parents were dead. I didn't talk to them. I talked to them here. but I didn't talk to them physically. You don't have to confront a person to do forgiveness. But if you can forgive them in your heart, it takes away that big, mean piece of fiery coal and replaces it with love. It gives you that space to just add more love to your life. And there's nothing in this world that's better than love, in every form. In every form. So that's my message. I encourage all of you, if you have people you need to forgive, to think about forgiving them so that you can open up your life to be your best possible self. Because we all have that opportunity to do that if we choose to. But it is a choice, and it's a choice every day when we get up. I say every day when I get up, I look outside and I say, what a beautiful day. Thank you, Lord. It's a beautiful day. I'm grateful for this. And then I can start my day with gratitude and love.